So once I have my base layer of colors on my Alebrijes, and for my example here, I am still dividing him between the two types of base color. So my neutral base color, I did the front body, I did the wings and the head, and my color base color, which are adjacent colors that have to have a primary and a secondary. So in my case it was green, blue, and blue-green when mixed together. I did for the tail and the back, so I have room to demonstrate the last part of our Alebrije sculpture. And that is adding the patterns. So as I mentioned, we are going to be using patterns, and since we are running low on time, we originally were going to work with a mandala, which is another art form that we talked about when we talked about patterns the other day. And we used the Statler website to create our own mandala. You had to use all 6 layers. You had to play around with contrast and size and spacing with each of the shapes. You had to have 12 shapes per layer. Now that I have that mandala, I'm going to use some of these patterns on my Alebrijes. Now remember, in the one video we watched, the family of the original artists of Alebrijes mentioned that for it to be considered an Alebrijes, it had to meet 3 of the 4 elements: wind, water, fire, or earth. I mentioned that you had to look at your sculpture and to determine which one or possibly 2 elements yours met. This example here is part bird and part fish, so I can count that as water and wind. And so I need at least one more element. So when I was doing my design, remember, I chose this one because it kind of had a flame-like existence, and so did this shape out here, the inside part. So I want to make sure I definitely try to put a similar pattern like this on my Alebrijes somewhere. So I'm going to use this mandala that I designed on the Statler website as inspiration for my patterns. So when it comes to applying patterns, if you chose a color base layer of adjacent colors, then you are applying your patterns with black and white neutrals. Now you could make grays if you want, but for now I'm just going to work with black and white. So looking at my Alebrijes and looking at my mandala patterns, I'm going to select a pattern that I think would look good somewhere on a section of the body. Now if you remember back to our presentation of Alebrijes, a lot of times they were sectioned off and different patterns applied into those sections. So you do have the option of doing that. So I don't have to use one whole pattern to fill up this tail area. I could outline it first, break it into smaller parts, and apply different patterns within it. You're going to want a small brush, so you want to find one of the smallest brushes you have in our sets of paintbrushes. If you can't find one, come see me. I do have a few small brushes. And what I like to do is try to get it into as much of a point as possible. So if I start with something with black here, I'm going to roll my bristles into it to try to bring them to as much of a point. Now you do have the option of using a pencil to first draw on your Alebrijes. Even if you have black, because you used the neutral base layers, the shininess of the graphite should still show up enough for you to work with this pattern. So I like that teardrop pattern, and I think here I'm going to create some teardrop shapes. So I'm going to just use my pencil, sketch out a couple of teardrop shapes. So I have an idea where I'm going to place them. I think I'm going to fit 5 on here. Okay. Once I've sketched it out, then I'm using neutrals on this color area. I'm going to carefully, as best as I can, make the outline for my teardrop. Now when you paint a small area, pressure on your paintbrush is important. So if I want to try to keep my line as small as possible, I don't want to put a lot of pressure on the bristles of my brush. So I'm just touching the tips of them to my sculpture, and if I make a mistake, I'm gonna have to kind of work with it, try to figure out what it is I want to do to correct any type of mistake I may make while painting this, because once it's on there, it's kind of hard to remove. You could, while it's really wet, possibly remove it with a little bit of water, but you know, once, especially black paint, once it's on there, it's hard to remove. So don't get discouraged if you do make a mistake. Find a way to incorporate it in to your design. So again, if I want my line to be as thin as possible with these paintbrushes, I want to apply very little pressure to the tips of the bristles so I can keep my line as thin as possible. Am I going to have some skips and jumps in my lines? Yes, because our surface still has some divots in it. But I'm going to do as best as I can to make it as close to a clean line as possible. Now remember, our patterns in our mandalas are our inspiration. We are painting on a smaller surface, so if I can't fit all the parts of a certain pattern on my Alebrijes while I'm painting it, that's okay. So I'm taking the parts I like, and applying them to my mandala. Sorry, to my Alebrijes. Now, when working with the neutral patterns, you can mix and match. You don't have to make every single pattern black. You will want to be careful, though, if you do want to switch to white, that your black is dry. But I'm going to attempt here to demonstrate is I want some white dots. So if you look at my pattern here, there's kind of like leaf shapes with lines in them, and there's a dot at the end. So I'm going to make the dot in white, at least on the larger line here. This will increase my contrast in my patterns and my designs and add more interest. So notice all I'm doing for these little dots is I'm taking the non-bristled end of my paintbrush, dipping it in paint, and then just touching it to my design. So if I do something like that, I want to make sure I clean off the end of my paintbrush. Now sometimes your paint may be a little thick, so when we're working with the pattern part, you can thin it out a little bit. You don't want it as thin as watercolor, but you do want it to flow nicely off of your paintbrush. I like the contrast of black and white against each other, so I will probably combine both black and white lines and shapes into my patterns as I make them. Do you have to? No. You can use all black, all white in one pattern. Now, since we took the time to create all these gradients on here, we do want to make sure that we are using just lines and shapes. We don't want to color anything in because we want the color that we already applied to show onto our design. So that's a little bit of a simplified version of the teardrop shape here in my mandala. Next to it are these shapes. And I do kind of like this negative space that this is creating between these. So I do think I'm going to try working with that. I'm just going to create kind of a little curved V shape between these black lines. So that's the beginning of applying patterns on my adjacent color base layer. So I'm going to let that dry a little bit, and now let's talk about if we're working with a black and white or neutral base layer. And for this one, I'm allowed to use color for my patterns. And you're going to have to use a triadic color set. So you'd want to pull out your color wheel, and you have your triadic triangle on there, and you're going to want to move that to a set of colors. You can use tertiaries. You'll have to mix them though. Or you can use secondaries or a triadic set. You have two different triadic sets for your tertiaries. And of course your primary colors are a triadic set. So I'm going to just use primary colors for my triadic set. And again, the same thing I started back here in my color version of the base layer. In my neutral version, I'm going to again choose some patterns that I can use to apply to my black and white base layer. So I do have one on here that has a bit of a diamond shape with some rounded, maybe feather-like shapes attached to it. So I think I'm going to apply that somewhere on the wing here. And I think I might use the tip of the wing as part of my diamond. And then the rounded feather-like shapes attached to it. And coming off to the side. So for this one, same thing as what I discussed with my black and white patterns. I can use all the different colors of my triadic set to create these patterns. I can choose two for a certain pattern. I could do one, but it does look a little bit better the more variation you have while doing this. So I'm going to start with blue. And I'm going to start making my pattern. Now, you could also make these into tints or shades. That is fine as long as you're still using a triadic color set. So if I don't like the color of the blue right out of the bottle, I can create a tint or shade with it. This is a lighter blue. So right now I'm just going to use it as is. And get my diamond point on there. So again, I should let this dry. What I would do is, if I'm going to mimic and have the same pattern on the other wing, is to go ahead and come over here and create it. Now, if I do want to try a tint, I'm going to pull over or get some white paint, because if you are working with your triadic colors for your neutral base layer, you're not going to have white or black on your plate unless you request it. And I'm going to make a tint of blue. So now that I have my tint of blue, I'm going to paint on my diamond shape. And I do think I like the lighter blue color up against the gray, at least in person. Comparing those, I do think that shows up a little bit more vibrantly. So I'm going to carefully go over this one with my lighter blue, my tint of blue. And again, we make mistakes, we learn to live with them. We try to make whatever corrections we can to make it look okay, but we're not going to try to erase things. Figure out a way in which you can work with any type of mistake you could make on here. Now, does this mean I have to use that same tint of blue anytime I want to apply blue on my black and white side? No, that does not mean you have to use the same tint of blue. You can make other tints of blue. You can go straight back to the blue out of the bottle color. You do have those choices. Since I am experimenting here with tints, I think for my other colors, I will make tints of those also. And sometimes also a tint, or working with white and your color, can also help increase the opaqueness, and that means how much you can kind of see through the paint when working with it when it's on a surface. And sometimes certain paints have a little bit more translucent qualities to them, meaning we can see through them a little bit more, and it takes a little bit more layers of them to cover up an area when you're painting one color on top of another. And sometimes others are very bold and cover things up really well. So I'm going to use my yellow, and I'm going to create one of the feather-like shapes of this pattern I'm using. And I want it for my middle feather that comes out of the top of my diamond. Now for this one, since I'm getting into that whiter, lighter area, the yellow is not going to show up as well against the white. So maybe I shouldn't have made it a tint. So again, that could be something I might have to go back and correct and try adding some regular yellow out of the bottle with it on top of that. So do consider that when you're working on any part of your Alebrijes. If you have the color base layer, if you have a really light tint that you made, if you made tints with it, then white might not show up in those areas. So white might not be a good color to put on a certain place. If you have a really dark color, if you made shades in your adjacent color base layer, well then black might not show up. So you may not be able to use black in certain areas. And when it comes to our neutrals, when we're working with white, certain colors are already very light. As we know, obviously yellow is one of those colors. So I may not want to work with creating tints if I'm getting into an area in which white is going to be there. So those are some things to consider as we start applying these patterns to our Alebrijes. Now I'm planning to then go with red for the next layer over to the left and right, and maybe another tint of blue or another different tint of yellow or another tint of red. I have choices here, and it's just planning out and deciding on what would make the best decisions for my area. So you have to kind of think a little bit while doing this. You have to get a little creative with it also. I could even, and if it's only for the fact that the white and yellow near each other just don't show up too well, but I could have made different values of a yellow tint and made each feather a little bit darker as it came down, or so forth. But for now I'm going to add red so I can get a little bit of each of my triadic colors onto my project. And I may cover up that yellow. I think by the time I have that blue and that red here, not sure I'm liking the yellow. I don't think it stands out enough to really compete with those. But I'll also let it fully dry and make my decision a little bit later on. And since I am getting into a darker area, maybe I will try that tint of yellow down this way more. Maybe up against the gray color, it will show up better and be able to compete with the blue and red. So let's give it a try here. Whew. Lost my grip there. Thankfully, it did not land on my Alebrijes, but if it had, again, that would be something I would have to make a correction. So the yellow does show up a little bit better up against that gray. So I do like it in these darker tone areas. Now if I run out of room, if I start a pattern, and like here I don't really have a lot of room to come around, I could try wrapping it around the object, or just kind of imagine where it would go and where it would reappear at on my sculpture. So that one I wrapped around. So that's what my pattern has started to look like on my neutrals base layer. So again, I want to keep to my triadic colors. I can also use that same dot method even with color paints. And I've just continued to apply my patterns to here. So that is how we're going to apply the patterns to our Alebrijes. So that is going to be the final stage of our Alebrijes, incorporating our patterns that we created in our mandalas on that Statler site, and filling up as much as we can in the time we have left in class with patterns on our sculpture. So that is the end of our Alebrijes journey. I hope you enjoyed learning about this art form and the area in which it was created, and about the artists who started this wonderful, interesting cultural artwork. Thank you for coming on this journey with me. I can't wait to see your end results.